D, wait for it, delightful.
Check out the name tag. You're in my world now, Grandma.
Ever since we can remember, the magical world of cinema has been a huge part of pop culture. After a long week of hard work, one of our favorite things to do is go out and see a movie. Due to the fact that movie-going is such a popular activity, filmmakers and producers are constantly churning out new flicks, and local theaters are always making sure that they have the latest releases playing. We'd like to think that most of the time that we go to the movie, it lives up to our expectations, and sometimes it does even better than what we originally expected. For this reason, we have been accustomed to greatness in the movie theater, and our expectation levels are very high. Filmmakers are constantly trying to reinvent and surprise us with new ideas on the screen, because they know that we have seen it all. Sometimes these new concepts do quite well with the public, and sometimes they fall embarrassing flat. Here are the worst rated movies of all time. Dumb and Dumber When Harry Met Lloyd. How do you screw up a movie that is supposed to be about screw-ups? Well, I'll tell you how. You take Jim Carrey and Jeff Daniels out of the production. Dumb and Dumber was intended to be an origin story of how the main characters of the original Dumb and Dumber met. But the problem was that most of the original film's appeal was in its casting, of Jim Carrey in particular. Rule of thumb, you don't remove Jim Carrey from a Jim Carrey movie. Vampires Suck. Vampires Suck is a response to all of the emerging vampire movies of the 21st century, an attempt to discredit and make fun of the trend that new millennials have enjoyed to be a part of an ever since True Blood and Twilight became immensely popular. However, in their attempt to make a fun of the vampires, they made themselves look pretty dumb in the process. It's a low blow type of comedy that lacks much needed in depth and its quality. The Emoji Movie. The issue with this movie is that there have been so many movies that have emerged lately depicting real-life versions of things you'd never expect, such as the Lego Movie or Pixels, or even B-Movie. But while sometimes they hit the mark beautifully, it was not the case with the Emoji Movie. Many people saw the concept as an attempt to glorify the world of texting. There is a city in the movie called Texopolis, and they weren't too keen on buying it into it. Frozen. Just relax, everyone. I'm not talking about the Frozen made by Disney in any way, shape, or form, because whether or not you like it, it was a huge hit. No, there was actually another film called Frozen, a horror film released in the year 2010 about a group of friends who went snowboarding and found themselves left alone on a chairlift over an entire weekend. Moviegoers reportedly said that they actually got sick in the theater due to the particularly disturbing scene. Jaws 3D. Here is an example of a movie that was the sequel of one of the most successful movies of all time. The problem when trying to live up to such a monstrous success is that it can sometimes be very hard to outdo it without coming off like a gimmick. It's almost like the first Jaws was the shark itself. The sequel was our helpless victim thinking he was fighting chance of survival against a clear and obvious threat. The Avengers. Again, I ask you not to jump out of your screen in anger and take a quick look at the year that this Avengers came out. I'm not talking about the recent Avengers series, which obviously was a huge hit, spawning multiple other Marvel films. No, this is a much older Avengers film that didn't do very well in the box office, or in the hearts of Marvel fans. Perhaps the CGI wasn't fully developed yet, or maybe the world just wasn't ready for superhero films yet. The Devil Inside. Sometimes a movie succeeds real well in communicating a certain message, but doesn't do the greatest job in effectively helping the viewer understand it. And when the subject is something as scary as the concept of the devil or a demon, the filmmakers need to be really careful with how they approach the subject. This movie successfully opened up these concepts, but left viewers feeling disturbed and far from satisfied with how they felt about these sensitive topics. Movie 43. For whatever reason, the premise of this movie was wild enough to attract the likes of A-list actors such as Hugh Jackman, Kate Winslet, and Emma Stone, to only mention a few. Unfortunately, what initially seemed like a good idea turned into a giant flop. This strangely appalling film failed to amuse audiences and critics alike, with movie critic Roger Ebert saying that he wished he could take a pill that would erase the memory of watching it. Meet the Spartans. Another movie that's sole purpose is to ridicule other better movies that came before it. This one sought out to make fun of war-related movies, most specifically Zack Snyder's 300, a film about ferocious Spartans that go to war. Perhaps the reason that these spoof movies fail to hit home with audiences is because it reeks of unoriginality. At some point, maybe it would do the movie creators some good to write their own story and see how easy it is to do before making fun of someone else's. Stop, or my mom will shoot. There are many movies out there that fiddle with the idea of a certain type of comedy, a conceptual idea that can grab the attention of some and make others absolutely nuts. This movie is an example of that. Sylvester Stallone stars as a police officer who is joined by his meddlesome mother, eager to help him out on the force. The concept really didn't work for most audiences, and many thought that Stallone wasn't too happy about it either. Mr. Magoo. There's yet another film that centers around a certain type of comedy that does a good job, alienating a large percentage of the movie-going population. Mr. Magoo, who is based around a cartoon, is one of those wacky personas, and not unlike that of the book personality, Amelia Bedelia. He's always getting himself into the most ridiculous situations imaginable, for the most absurd reasons. Not everyone is into this type of humor, and it seemed that the creation of the Mr. Magoo film was required for them to realize this. Dungeons and Dragons. A movie that was made in an attempt to cater to the hordes of lovers of Dungeons and Dragons, the game, were afraid to announce that they missed the mark terribly in their attempt to live up to their standards. What makes the game so fun is the imagination involved. When a bunch of young friends sit down to their living room and play the game, they get to make up the characters in their heads, as opposed to a movie doing the work for them. Pluto Nash. Cue another disappointing sigh. Eddie Murphy is one of the funniest humans on the planet, but it was never thanks to his later movies. We get it. He got older, had kids, and wanted to make more family-friendly content that wasn't inappropriate for his children to watch. The problem was that all of us had to suffer in the process. Pluto Nash made us forget that Coming to America ever existed, let alone his classic hour-long stand-up Eddie Murphy Raw. The Apparition. This movie was very ambitious in its attempts to frighten audiences with an entity that is constantly unseen. The intended fear in The Apparition is a ghostly presence that is constantly making claw marks and random noises around the house of a certain couple. The problem that many movie critics had was that much of these cinematic concepts had already been explored before, and there wasn't much renewal, leaving most moviegoers kind of bored throughout it all. Epic movie. From the same creators who made the spoof movies Vampires Suck, Date Movie, and Meet the Spartans, came another movie aimed to make fun of a group of films. This time, there were film in the epic category, as if all the other genres are mutually exclusive, which they absolutely aren't. Once again, they failed miserably to subtly communicate their message in a tasteful manner, resorting to crude means of humor that involve urine, pimples, and vomit. Gross. Bucky Larson, Born to be a Star. There was a recurring conversation that happened around the time that Bucky Larson, Born to be a Star came out. It was between the people that saw the movie and the people that refrained from watching it after thinking about seeing it and then decided that it looked terrible. The conversation would go like this. Oh, you watched that? Yeah, it was that great? Yeah, it wasn't that great. I'm not surprised. It didn't look too great. I should have done what you did. Stan Helsing. Here is another movie that made a strong attempt to feed off the genius of previous films, but did so desperately that it was quite transparent. The movie is centered around a couple who walk around a city that is infested with the most evil villains in movie history, including the likes of Freddy Krueger. But when all you have are evil villains, they start to all become less scary. And if they aren't scary, what's the point in watching a horror movie? From Justin to Kelly. This movie is the result of filmmakers thinking they could manufacture a hit out of two successful singers' reality shows in a young tween comedy that young tweens could relate. It ended up looking like a greased wannabe movie that didn't exactly deliver in the department of performances, writing, or overall substance. We understand that they were trying to do, but they seem to have missed the mark. Son of the Mask. What did I say the rule of thumb should be? Don't take a movie that was successful thanks to the comic genius of Jim Carrey and then attempt to recreate it without Jim Carrey. It simply doesn't work. Movie critic Richard Roeper, rest in peace, even said that watching the movie was the closest he had even come to walking out of a film. And when he looked back on his experience, he says that he wished he had. Kazam. Here's another rule I haven't mentioned. Just because a person is an amazing athlete doesn't mean he will be a good actor. Kazam was further proof that Shaquille O'Neal left his talents on the basketball court. I'll be honest, out of all movies on this list, Kazam is probably the least worst. Just because it was kind of fun for kids to see their favorite basketball player in that light. But still, I have to ask if the whole thing was worth it. 50 Shades of Black. Another movie that attempted to ride the coattails of a movie that did well, yet ironically tries to make fun of the movie in the process. The paradoxical nature is something that viewers pick up very well, and they weren't such fans of the way it translated when 50 Shades of Black came out on the big screen. In order to be a successful spoof movie, there needs to be a certain level of subtlety in the mix. And this movie fails to come through in that regard. The Human Centipede. This is perhaps the most grotesque movie of all time. I didn't even want to talk about it because its premise is so vile. Someone really had issues when they came up with this script. And I'll spare you the details, leaving you with a small hint. It's about a person who does physical experiments on humans. I trust that you'll be able to understand what it's about when you piece it together with a title. And try not to throw up when you do. It's pretty gross. Geely. There was a period in the early 2000s when Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez were an item. Now, I'm not sure what came first, their relationship or a movie which involved their characters being in a relationship, but I can tell you that both of those ventures didn't turn out too well. Considering Affleck and Lopez both have enjoyed illustrious careers regardless, I'm sure they aren't both bothered too much by it. But many people that saw their movie in the theater weren't too happy about it. The Fog. Here we have a remake of a 1979 horror classic, which pretty much fell flat on its face. Apparently people thought that the newer version wasn't very scary, and actually relatively boring at times. In addition, people saw right through the studio's attempts to cater to younger audiences by introducing a much younger cast, saying that they may have been younger, but they were also a lot less intelligent. At the end of the day, some remakes just failed to live up to their predecessors. Alone in the Dark. This was action film adaptation of the Atari game Alone in the Dark, and after people watched it, they ended up giving reviews that suggested that they wish they had spent an hour and a half playing the game version instead. One critic on Rotten Tomatoes even said that it was a violent and incomprehensible piece of gibberish. Another said that the flat dialogue between the characters were barely more adept than the Atari version. Baby Geniuses. Once again, we have a movie that thinks it can rely solely on an intriguing gimmick and think that it will be able to sustain an audience for a whole 2 hours in a theater. Having babies that can talk might be kind of fun in a 3-minute SNL skit, but for an entire film, not so much. At least that's how most critics felt about it. One critic even said that you can feel your brain rotting as you watch this movie. Look Who's Talking Now. This is the third film in a trilogy of movies where we have unexpected dialogue coming from certain characters. In the first movie, Look Who's Talking, the baby was talking. This kind of worked, and most people enjoyed the film. But by the time they got to the third movie, Look Who's Talking Now, it was the pets who were talking, and most people were already pretty sick of the gimmick. Battlefield Earth. Let's just say that John Travolta has seen better days. After this movie came out, it didn't knock too many people off their feet, quite like Grease Lightning did. In a movie that resembled some sort of Planet of the Apes / Star Trek knockoff brand, the writing and production didn't exactly hit home. Critics said that the logic was in short supply, with burned out cities somehow having electricity, and dusted up buried jets somehow fueling up after 1,000 years of hibernation. Saving Christmas. This was one of the awkward movies that didn't exactly succeed on hitting its intended mark. Kirk Cameron, better known for his portrayal of Mike Seaver from the hit family sitcom Growing Pains, stars as himself in a film where he aims to revive the spirit of Christmas. The strange thing about this film is that he seems to be preaching to the choir. He attempts to teach a population of proud Christians about the true meaning of Christmas, and they don't seem to be thrilled about it. Stolen. This film is about a father who is committed to getting to the bottom of who murdered his son, and throughout this process he stumbles upon another homicide that occurred 50 years previously. While this plot seems like an enticing premise on paper, the screenplay didn't quite live up to its expectations, and ended up being a flop. What made it even harder to stomach was the fact that the movie was filled with a star-studded cast, such as Jon Hamm and Jessica Chastain. Pat the movie. This movie is a result of what happens when you take something that might have been funny in one context and put it in another context only to watch it fail miserably. Such was the case with It's Pat the Movie. When SNL's Julia Sweeney transitioned her androgynous Pat character from the small screen to the big screen, the humor didn't exactly hold up for a 90-minute film, and it left people wishing they had just stayed at home. Surfer Dude. There are many actors that are able to thrive when part of a great script, but lose their overall appeal when the script isn't great. Matthew McConaughey is one of those actors. Considering his Dazed and Confused role was absolutely classic, and yet his appearance in this movie seemed very forced. The movie is essentially about nothing. Just McConaughey sitting around shirtless at the beach trying to figure out his life. Doesn't that sound like an interesting premise? 1,000 Words. 1,000 Words is about a smooth literary agent who can talk his way into closing any deal. When trying to deceive a spiritual guru, a mysterious Bodhi tree appears in his backyard, and he soon finds out he can only use as many words as there are leaves on the tree. And then, you guessed it, chaos ensues. It didn't take the critics many words to describe their distaste for the movie, which took a talented star like Eddie Murphy and forced the words out of his mouth. Ed. When starring in a hit sitcom, there's always a risk of being forever recognized as your old character. That's probably why Matt LeBlanc, who was 2 seasons into Friends, decided to take on a role in a family comedy, Ed. The movie centers around a semi-talented baseball player who gets upstaged by his new teammate, a chimpanzee. What's even more absurd, the chimp is actually played by 2 acrobats in a suit. The premise of Ed, in addition to its poor execution, was enough to make the movie a complete bust. Simon Says, I have 4 words to say about this film. Dennis Rodman action thriller. The former basketball star perhaps should have stuck to his former career in this case. Simon Says focuses on a former CIA agent who helps a friend out when his daughter is abducted. The former agent is assisted by a pair of monks in order to track down the kidnappers using computer hacking. The action flick turned out to be a spy movie cliche, and in the words of Entertainment Weekly, was excruciatingly formulaic. Mac and Me. Mac and Me is a family movie about a family of aliens who were abducted from their home planet to be studied on Earth. After trying to escape, the youngest of the family, Mac, mysterious alien creature, befriends a human boy named Eric. If this plot sounds somewhat familiar, it might be because of the creators attempted to ride on the back of Spielberg's alien classic E.T. The movie was not only lacking in heart that E.T. had, but was also filled with product placement far beyond good taste. United Passions. United Passions tells the story of how the Fédération Internationale Football Association, or FIFA, was formed, starring big names like Gérard Depardieu, Tim Roth, and Sam Neill. It wouldn't necessarily be so bad if it wasn't for its poor timing. Following the making of the United Passions, several FIFA officials were being indicted for multiple charges of alleged corruption, which is probably why the film, mostly funded by FIFA themselves, seemed to the viewers like one big propaganda for the organization. Ballistic, X versus Sever. Ballistic X vs. Sever is about two former agents who go head-to-head trying to get what is described as the world's most dangerous weapon. Apparently, the movie was so bad that the director not only decided to use an alias for it, but said he couldn't bring himself to do movies for 2 years after it was released. The film was also deemed most rotten movie of all time by Rotten Tomatoes, with 116 reviews and a score of 0%. Mortal Kombat Annihilation. It's hard to say why the popular video game Mortal Kombat needed another movie made after it, especially since the first film's critical response was mixed at best. This time, the evil Outworlders are back with a new plan to overtake Earth, and it's up to Liu Kang and his combat friends to save it. Although packed with action, the sequel is riddled with cliches and has very few redeeming qualities, making it better to just stick to the video game. The Singing Forest. The Singing Forest probably has one of the stranger plots I've ever encountered. The film follows Christopher, who becomes convinced that he is the reincarnation of a German resistance fighter who was killed in the Holocaust. He soon begins to believe that his daughter's soon-to-be husband is actually his lover from said past life. This unconvincing plot may have made for a better film if it weren't topped with overly dramatic dialogues, making the whole experience difficult to watch. National Lampoon's Gold Diggers. This comedy is about two inept conmen, Calvin and Leonard, who try to scam two rich older women and marry them for their money. The women, who turn out to be broke, plan to marry the boys and kill them for the life insurance money. After a few attempts at killing each other, the four end up robbing someone else. So, all in all, the characters are all pretty terrible people. Viewers describe the movie to be a painfully unfunny and mostly just unpleasant. Septic Man. Chiller film Septic Man is about Jack, a sewer worker, who is trying to uncover the reason water contamination crisis is in his town. While investigating, Jack gets trapped in an underground septic tank and goes through a truly horrendous change of appearance. The film might have achieved its purpose to horrify and gross out its viewers, but as it turns out, people who watched the film just found it way too revolting and were left with a terrible aftertaste. Among Ravens. This Amy Smart dramedy may have had some potential in the beginning, but the story is told through the eyes of a 10-year-old girl and focuses on a group of friends and family who gather to celebrate the 4th of July. The mix of complicated relationships eventually causes secrets to be revealed as the film progresses. However, reviewers thought the potentially solid plot was tarnished by a lackluster script written with stereotypes and badly written characters. Dirty Love. Dirty Love is about an attractive woman who believes she's in a happier relationship with her boyfriend until she is betrayed by him. Feeling despaired, she goes on a journey to someone better, with one bad date after the other. The R-rated comedy was actually written by Jenny McCarthy, who also stars in it, and directed by her husband at the time, John Asher. While the two obviously tried to make a funny flick, its humor was extremely low, and audiences found it too awkward to watch. The Hottie and the Naughty. I hate to say that Paris Hilton is not much of an actress, but the problem is that the numbers speak for themselves. She may have gotten famous for her other reasons, but when The Hottie and the Naughty hit the big screen, people weren't so keen on accepting her as an actress. In a movie that tried to send a message of "it's what's on the inside that matters," it ended up sending the exact opposite message. Disaster movie. It's ironic that the title of this movie is attempting to be sarcastic and manages to be so close to the truth. Yes, this movie was an absolute disaster, receiving 1 star on IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes, as well as a solid 1% rating on the latter site as well. The movie intends to poke fun at movies that are about natural disasters, but like many other films in this genre, people considered it to be virtually unwatchable. But hey, at least it starred Kim Kardashian. Twilight. Twilight may have been a huge phenomenon that every teen and tween was obsessed with back in the day, but there's something we need to discuss. It is not a good movie. While it may have been a box office hit and people flocked in the millions to the theaters to see it, the acting left much to be desired and the plot, well, that too. In fact, Twilight was recently been voted the worst movie of all time on Ranker. That took far too long, if you ask me. Catwoman. People got very excited when billboards of Halle Berry in a Catwoman suit started appearing on the streets, confident about the fact that the Batman spinoff would be a guaranteed success. But these people were sadly disappointed, owing to the fact that the movie billboards were pretty much the only good thing about the movie. Movie critics and fans alike reported the movie to be dull and awkward, with predictable fighting scenes and unintentional laughs. Hey nerds, if you like this video, go ahead and click that Geek What icon and subscribe. If you want to see more videos like this, join me every Tuesday where you can check out the list.